When I booked my V-Strom 800 in with Suzuki for some work recently, I was given a GSX-8R as a courtesy bike for the day. Now I didn't plan on recording it, but I loved the bike so much that I decided to make a review. The first thing I noticed is just how comfortable it is. I'm 6'1" and my legs only had a gentle bend at the knee, and the 8R feels even less cramped than my MT10, which itself is a pretty comfortable naked bike. I test rode an Aprilia RS660 last year, expecting it to be a super comfortable sport bike, but the ergos were too aggressive for me and I turned back to the dealer almost immediately, whereas I would have happily taken this thing for the whole weekend if they let me. The seat doesn't push you forward into the tank and the bars are so high up and far back that I sat almost bolt upright with only a slight lean forward. Now the ergos do of course mean that you get a fair amount of wind blast with a stock screen, so I would personally find any motor work quite tiring. Sitting at 70 to 80 on a bike with no wind protection doesn't bother me while I'm on the bike, but it drains me and I'm always really tired at the end of the day after long stints on the motorway. The 8R suspension is also pretty compliant for a sports bike. I went over a few potholes and it had plenty of give and didn't jar my back like my MT10 does when it's in sport mode. Now it still felt good in the corners, although this was filmed on a cold day in November, so I wasn't exactly trying to get my elbow down. And if you haven't already worked out, the 8R just isn't a hardcore sports bike at all, and I found it more comparable in character to a naked bike. I still found it really good fun, and I'm sure it would do a good job on a track day if that's your sort of thing, but it's more the kind of sensible fun your mum would be okay with than the balls to the wall mayhem you buy a proper supersport for. The seat doesn't look like much, and I suspect that might be one of the limiting factors in how long you can spend on an 8R, but for what it's worth, it actually felt okay to me, although I would definitely look for a comfort seat on the aftermarket if I bought one. Now it has the same engine as my V-Strom 800 of course. I would have expected it to be tuned differently in a sports bike than it is in my big heavy adventure bike, but it actually felt more or less identical to me, so I think it either has the same state of tune or a very similar one. I kept it in A mode, which is the sportiest throttle response, and it didn't feel snatchy at all, just nice and keen, and I only ever move away from A mode on my V-Strom if it's raining. Now this probably isn't the first video you've watched on a bike with this 800cc engine, and I'm going to say more or less the same thing as everybody else. It's got plenty of grunt and feels more torquey than you might think. Lazy third gear overtakes are its forte, and while it only has 80 hp, it's definitely fast enough to feel like real fun, and I never find myself wanting more power, and as long as you don't go in expecting it to be absolutely rapid, I don't think you'll be disappointed with the power. Now wing mirrors isn't the sexiest subject to talk about, but they are brilliant on the 8R. You do get a bit of elbow of course, but they stick out quite a long way, so the view behind is really good, and I don't even think they look too dorky despite how far they stick out. And being sport bike mirrors, you can of course fold them in for a bit of tight filtering, which I took advantage of to get through a bit of traffic at the end of my ride. And they pop back into place perfectly when you've finished, so you don't have to reset the mirror position when you've cleared the traffic. Now looks are subjective of course, but it's a sport bike at the end of the day, so I think most people will think it's cool, and I think it looks absolutely fantastic. The front end is so aggressive looking, and I found myself looking back at it every time I got off the bike. The frame isn't a steel treaders frame, but you still get a bit of scaffolding on the subframe, which looks pretty sweet, although I think the pillion pegs are welded to the subframe, so you can't remove them to tidy up the look, which I like to do on my bikes. The swing arm looks a bit cheap, as does the exhaust, which also sounds a bit meh as stock, and because the catalytic converter is built into the end can, you can't just switch out the end can, and you'd need to go for a full cat delete system if you wanted to get a better look. And I can't quite make up my mind on the paint job of this particular bike. I think the silver looks great, but the wheels are the colour of a vet's forearm, which is never a good look. There's a limited edition black and gold version though, which I think looks absolutely awesome, and some markets get a yellow and black version which really stands out too. But I'd be totally happy with either the standard black or blue, and I reckon I could even make my peace with the silver and burgundy version I rode. There were of course a few things I didn't like. Firstly, the screen is pretty terrible as I mentioned. It gets a little better when you tuck in behind it, but even then it's not great, and a bigger double bubble screen would be the first mod I'd do if I bought one. The bike is also really quite heavy. Apart from being a little slow to flick from side to side, you don't feel the weight too much when you're moving, but it was a real effort rolling it around on my driveway, and its weight belies its otherwise quite compact size. Now that's probably less of an issue if you have a nice flat firm driveway, but mine is a semi-gravelled mess of lumps and bumps, and I hate wheeling heavy bikes around on it. The components also feel a bit cheap, as you might expect from a cheap bike. The brakes stop the bike just fine, but you don't get any feel from them, and if you've ever ridden a bike with a proper Brembo setup, you'll know just how good it feels to have really decent brakes. And the suspension feels a bit cheap too. While it is comfy and compliant, it doesn't give you much feedback as to what's going on underneath you, which I suppose is a price you pay for comfort, but it still left me a little cold in the bends, and I wouldn't mind if it was 10 to 20% sportier and a little bit stiffer. And all of that means that the 8R is just not a particularly exciting bike. The engine really is punchy and it's good fun at low speeds, but it runs out of puff just when you want things to start getting exciting, and it doesn't feel fast enough to give you that real rush you get from something a bit quicker. And to me, it feels like it wants to be ridden mostly sensibly, not mostly hard. I'm sure a decent rider can get more out of it than an average biker like me, and you can still give it a bit of a seeing to occasionally, but thrashing it just isn't in its character and isn't where it feels happiest. But despite all of that, I still loved it. I can forgive its flaws for the comfort, looks and real world fun. And if I was in the market for a commuter bike, this would be right up there. I'd potentially be up for a bit of light touring on it too, but it doesn't have cruise control even as an option, which is a real shame given the bike is more of a sports tourer than an out and out sports bike. But you can buy factory panniers, so if you can put up with the wind blast and lack of cruise, you could take it away for a weekend here and there, although I'm personally at the stage of life when I make old man noises getting out of chairs, so while I would expect the 8R to be comfy enough for an all morning ride, I wouldn't expect to find it all day comfy. Now I tested the naked 8S version of this last year too, and I'd definitely choose the 8R over that, even if only for the looks. Although in an ideal world, I'd love Suzuki to put this engine in a supermoto and make a budget hypermotard. And at the time of recording, Suzuki have just announced a 400cc supermoto, so I'll be keeping my eye out for the price when it's revealed. Now I only had this bike for a day and I did less than 100 miles, so I'd be really interested to hear from anyone who owns the bike. If that's you, let me know if you agree with what I've said or if your experiences have been any different long term. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up and subscribe for next time, and until then, ride safe.